try to stay in the background as much as I can for the conference. But welcome, and we're going to get started. And Norman Reese from the Turn is going to lead us in our devotion, and Steve Annalise will be the moderator for the first paper session. So,
Good morning.
Good morning.
When you're talking to people about Jesus, right? Maybe you're a student or a coworker or somebody on the plane. One of the things that comes up is like, well, I thought, don't all religions basically teach the same thing? Is that some other way of life? And how do you respond to that? Here's a way to respond to that. You say, have you heard of the good-bad curve? Of course they haven't, right? And what is the good-bad curve? So the good-bad curve is basically, here is the time that you're born, t equals 0, and then your life moves forward day by day, and when you do good things, it's up here, and when you do bad things, it's down here. So maybe you start out as you're a young person, and you do some good, and then you do some bad, and then you do some good, and then do some bad. So most religions have a good-bad curve like this, and they look at the integral function, right? The area under the curve, and look at how much good you've done and then how much bad you've done, and you take that integral, and if it's positive, then you get, whatever religion you're in some type of benefit, right? You become God, or you're reincarnated as something nice, like a butterfly. And so it's basically the big balances in the sky idea, right? You do bad things, that puts weight in the bad side of the scale. You do good things, that puts weight in the good side of your scale. And hopefully when you die, you're balanced a little bit on the good side, and then you get some type of reward, right? So most religions are that way. Other types of religions, instead of being an integral function, maybe a point function, which is when you die, where are you when you die? It's that instant that you die that determines your future, right? Now, that's not Christianity, is it? Some people you're talking to may be, well, I thought that was Christianity, right? So what would the good-bad curve look like for Christianity? I'm getting you to think about that, right? So you start out with Christianity, you do good, that's what's expected. We have a perfect standard. God expects perfect obedience. You do bad, come down here, I do good, did some bad, do good, did some bad, okay? And you come down, So the Christian good-bad curve looks like this. Why is that? Because when you do good, you don't counteract bad. Good is expected. We have a perfect God who's perfectly holy. Okay? Now somebody really good, okay, like maybe Gail's good-bad curve, it looks like this, okay? A little bit better than mine. And then you have the serial killer, and it's like here, right? And we're all in a very narrow band, honestly, right? When God looks at sin, that's where it is. And Jesus said, be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the standard, right? And in James we read, he who knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. Right? So it's not just what we do, but what we don't do. If we know to do good and we don't do it, then that's sin. And this is good. This is our bad. T equals 0. So what do you think about that? Pretty depressing. It's like someone looking at this curve and saying, well, man, that looks like there's no chance of earning heaven. That's right, right? Read Romans. There's no chance. None of us are good, okay? So what do we do? How do we deal with this, right? God has a standard, this perfection, we're not there. And wherever God gives the command, he gives the way to deal with disobedience, right? And in the Torah, he gives the animal sacrifices, right? You can't do extra good to counteract bad, because extra good is expected. It's kind of interesting that like the picture of God sitting up on a cloud, looking down and Glorioski, right? Someone just Smedley Johnson just pulled over and helped the stranded motorist on the side of the road fix a tire. Wow, that's great. Well, that surprises me. That's worth extra points. God's not like that, right? You don't get extra points for doing what's expected. And because our God is holy, because he is just, then this makes perfect, reasonable sense. Right? But where God gives his commands, he gives a way to deal with the guilt, right? And that's through transferring the guilt onto something innocent, right? And sacrificing a perfect lamb or a goat or a ram. We can transfer that guilt onto something that doesn't deserve it. Right? And that didn't even cure sin, right? But that was a temporary thing until the perfect sacrifice would come. Right? So it would make up the difference here. And I don't know how you put a cross here or something that makes a difference, that takes all this punishment, all the area under our curve, all that sin, and transfers it onto Jesus. Right? And so we're able to avoid the punishment and the result of our sin by transferring our guilt onto Jesus. Okay? So this was a devotion I heard from my circus professor almost 30 years ago, Bill Graff, who came up with this idea, the good-bad curve. And Bill Graff taught circuits for over 40 years at LeTourneau. And generations of engineering students came through and heard devotions like this every class. I don't know how many of you get this opportunity, but at LeTourneau, all of our class periods are 55 minutes instead of 50 minutes, because every class starts with a 5-minute devotional. Okay, and that can be student-led or professor-led. And so for 40 years, Bill Graff taught devotions like this in that more like 10 minutes a class. And after all that time, over the last few years, the alumni started an effort to document his devotions and papers that he's written. And so those were put into a book, and we call it Engineering Your Faith. It's like 300 pages of Bill Graff's wisdom, his impact, his perspective. And we had a banquet last April where we released the book and had book signing and had 200 people, mostly alumni, come back and celebrate this man and his devotionals. So that's pretty humbling for me because I've never had any of my students ask for copies of my devotions. What would that look like, right? So my challenge for you, a couple of challenges. One is engineering, scientists, mathematic people have a different perspective on things, right? And we can come and weigh in on our theological discussions. Theologians are going to talk about point functions and integral functions, and somebody needs to, right? That's us, and that's part of why we're here, right? We want to discuss. We want to be part of that discussion and part of those writings, those publishings on how to explain God's truth from engineers are part of the body too, right? We've got to bring our perspective. The other challenge is, man, those opportunities you get to have a short talk with a student or prepare for a life group. Some of you probably lead life groups at your schools or have a Bible study at work or at church. Prioritize that, right? I'm guilty sometimes. I'm walking to class and I'll think, oh man, I got to come up with a devotional before I get to class. Right? That's not the way to do it. Right? I need to be thinking about it. Reading books in the summer to get ready, to prepare, because those moments have huge impact. Right? And years later, we students are still remembering what the circus professor taught. I used circuits twice in my life. One time was a failure. Right? It didn't work. I saw zero gravity plane at NASA, and the circuit didn't work. I don't know what happened. But his devotions, I've used, those thoughts I've used in my churches, and my friends, and my family have impacted people through how I've been impacted. Right? So really prioritize, prepare, think of what's going to impact. Ask your students what's going to impact. What do they want to know? Right? And make use of those opportunities. Okay? So let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the chance that all of us in this room have to share your truths. We don't deserve it, but you blessed us with that opportunity. It's made our lives significant on this little blue planet. We pray, Lord, that each of us here would handle that with care, would be good stewards of those moments and prepare for those, the impact that you'd have us have on our students, our coworkers, our family, those around us. It's an honor. In Jesus' name. I do have some of these books I'll pass around probably at lunch if you want to look at them. I'd be interested in seeing if you use these devotions in your class, you know, how that might work, or get your comments on the book. Thanks.
Session 1 is topics on education. We have 3 speakers, so let's get started with Gail Ermer speaking on program educational objectives, student outcomes, and institutional mission, a comparison. Gail, welcome to the podium.
Great to see you all here. It's an honor to sort of be the opening presentation. I am going to talk about what I think of as just a little exploratory research project related to program educational objectives and student outcomes and our mission. And hopefully in the time allotted, I'll be able to get to a little bit about my goals, the methods I used, particularly focusing on the program educational objectives first, and some themes that I found from those, and then move back on to the student outcomes and a few conclusions maybe and ideas for future work. So in terms of goals, I guess I've been thinking for a long time about, well, this whole conference has been thinking for a long time about how Christian values, Christian perspectives influence engineering work specifically. So sort of the tie between personal attributes and knowledge and professional. And so I had this question, not just sort of from a perspectival question, which we've had lots of papers, and we'll hear lots of papers about sort of bottom-up principles, but how does that reveal itself in our actual curricula? And maybe in some of the stages that go between basic principles and curricula. So my question was, how and to what extent are institutional mission reflected concretely in engineering program goals? And to understand that, it's hard to know what to look at, right? I could interview faculty, I could look at curricula that's really complex. But instead, I decided to focus on program educational objectives and student outcomes, and I'll define those a little bit more for those of you who don't live in the ABAT world. But they might be sort of a resource that I could look to see what's reflected there that is sort of specifically Christian, or maybe not so specifically Christian. What do we share with other institutions that wouldn't identify as Christian? So initiation, discovery, kind of what's out there, what themes are common to all engineering programs, what themes might be common or distinctive about Christian institutions. That was kind of where I started this. And so I went in, I guess, with a little bit of a model about how we might construct a curriculum. You can see if this matches your practice, but we have a set of Christian principles. This affects our institutional mission. If you look at our websites and our goals and mission statements, you can certainly see it there. I think of an engineering program mission as a subset of that broader mission of the institution. It's certainly what ABAT expects. And then if we have a set program mission, that should show up in our goals for our graduates, which are the PEOs, that then sort of cascades down into student objectives, and then that helps to define our curriculum. So my question was, well, do we actually see Christian principles sort of reflected in goals for graduates, and what would those kind of principles look like? And also then into the SOs as well. Do we see evidence there or not? And maybe think about why or not. Another way to think about it maybe is, okay, we have a Christian engineer practicing engineering. Their Christian life is obviously influenced by their Christian principles. If you take more of a dichotomy view of this, maybe that just affects sort of personal behavior, not so much professional behavior, whereas the secular principles come from ABET and other professional kinds of things. And at some point, those two streams come together and affect our life. But I guess we've always said that sort of that Christian principles affect professional expectations as well as the personal expectations. So I wanted to see if that came out. Well, I am not a sociologist by any means and didn't really have much experience analyzing texts. I have to be perfectly honest. So I was looking like analyzing text for dummies, something like that. And this was the closest thing I could find. So a resource that just talked about some analysis techniques, focusing in on sort of inductive techniques, looking at the text themselves and trying to draw out themes rather than sort of counting in previously defined categories. So that's kind of all I'll say about my analysis techniques. But I kind of accomplished this by looking at word counts, parsing things out into chunks or specific expressions or incidents or concepts, and then actually sorted pieces of paper on the table eventually, right? So not so high tech, but as a first exploration, I found it very interesting. So I did have sort of anticipated themes, and you have to admit, for any research project, you come in with your own categories. It's especially after experiencing many, many years of CPC and reading lots of papers. So I would have expected to see maybe some emphases on service to society, humanitarian, engineering, and appropriate technology, taking sort of a broad view of technology and incorporating value-ladenness, normativity, stewardship for sure, and then a focus on ethics and integrity. So just, I guess, full disclosure, that's kind of what was in the back of my mind as I started looking at the data. So I used two different data sets, the first for the PEOs and the second for the SOs. And for the PEOs, I looked at CCCU institutions that had engineering programs. So there are 16 of those that are currently accredited. So I didn't use the ones that are sort of in process or have 3-2 programs or other things. And then I picked a sample of secular institutions to do a comparison. And the secular institutions tried to cover a broad range. So some sort of Research 1 all the way down to liberal artsy kind of places that offer engineering, as well as some sort of regional, more technical schools. And then for the SO analysis, I focused on a broader list of Christian programs, the one that we have on our website. So actually there's like 62 different institutions, I think, listed with programs related to engineering on our website. I pulled out the ones that were ABET accredited. So backing up a little bit to ABET and what a PEO even is. For engineering program accreditation, ABET accredits those programs. It's the Engineering Accreditation Commission I'm most familiar with because that's where I operate. And they have 8 general criteria that most of you are probably very familiar with related to students and facilities and a lot of other different things. One of those criteria focuses on program educational objectives. So this basically says that the program must have published PEOs that are consistent with the mission of the institution, the needs of the program's various consistencies and these criteria. And then they also have to have a system for regularly evaluating them. And the definition of a PEO is that it is a broad statement that describes what graduates are expected to attain within a few years after graduation. So we're looking ahead to what students should be accomplishing, what are we preparing them to accomplish. And for me, the benefits of analyzing these statements were that they're out there and you have to have them, right? So every program, unlike a mission statement, some people have more explicit mission statements. Some are just really short, 2 lines. Some are, a whole white paper. It's hard to compare those kinds of things, but these were short. They're relatively succinct, which you would think means that you're focusing on the most high priority goals in the statements. And they're public by definition, so I don't have to survey anybody. I can just go on the web and find stuff. Now, the drawbacks might be that they do still vary in complexity and detail. And because they are short in terms of textual analysis, they might not give you as much stuff to work with as you would like to see. And I suspect some programs take these more seriously than others, right? For some folks, it's just an ABET thing. We have to have a couple statements that it makes sense that we work with. So with PEOs, the first thing I did was just count the words in them. So I pulled them out and found that there is quite a variation in length. So here you can see actually all the Christian institutions with engineering programs that were in my data set. The average number of words in those statements was 116, but the variation was quite high, all the way from 37, very short and sweet, up to 292. I think the difference in length was not even so much in the statements themselves, but in the context information. So in this piece of the analysis, I included any sort of introductory statements, like graduates will be doing this, X. And some people have a lot of framing stuff before and after too, that we're trying to capture, I think, things that maybe AVIC doesn't require, but that are a piece of the picture for us, obviously. So that was interesting. Again, if I'm kind of thinking of where I want to benchmark our PEOs, whether we might think about revising them, this gives me a sense of what the scope is. And for the secular programs that I picked to analyze, they were all significantly shorter. So a median of 83 words, less variation, primarily because they didn't just have this kind of contextual information that places them in. Some, especially Research One type institutions, were very pithy. I mean, they're essentially, we want to have our graduates be employed or in grad school. You know, it seems like the Christian programs are being a little bit more reflective about where they want their graduates to go and what they want to do. And maybe because the Christian programs are also more general in nature, there's not as much of an assumption of where they're going to go, so they feel the need to express that a little bit more. So I found that kind of interesting. So when I started to get down into themes, again, all the stuff on the table and putting things in categories, I got 3 slides that summarize them. I had 6 major themes and some sub-themes, and then the following 3 slides will try to do a comparison with the secular programs just to kind of see what's different. So there was certainly a focus on career professional productivity. We all want to produce graduates that are employable, I think. What I saw reflected there was this application of technical knowledge, problem solving also in a design context, sort of real world complex problems. We want them to be successful in their employment, to show excellence in some way. There was a leadership theme that came out, and also a social responsibility theme that came out in many of these. So again, I was taking everybody's PEOs, put them in one big document, and then analyzing themes, and the same for the secular group. So that's how these kind of came out. There was also a focus on continued learning. There was a focus on service. And then there were a lot of attributes described as part of the description of what our students would be doing. So these were the ones that showed up in the Christian programs. So perseverance, creativity, teamwork, cultural competency, communication, well-roundedness, and the idea of behaving ethically and with integrity. And then the last 2, I just put them under sort of a category of framing assumptions. So some of this has to do with knowledge about, but sort of knowing what Christian principles would affect your work. The sense of vocation or calling to engineering showed up here. Stewardship, where sustainability was in that context, showed up. And then in the Christian programs, there was also a few PEOs that included sort of beyond work expectations, like balance with family and church, etc., and actually things related to church participation. So now to switch to the secular programs, this slide looks exactly the same as the first slide for the Christian programs. So good match of the themes, actually. I would say the only difference was sort of in line 4 there, where there's a little bit more of a focus on employers, like expectations for graduates being met, which was not quite so prevalent in the Christian programs. In terms of the attributes, so now the second slide comparing it to, the first one and the second and last one were different. So where secular programs valued initiative and resourcefulness more than perseverance, it seems. Nobody mentioned perseverance in the secular programs. And the idea of entrepreneurship or financial implications didn't really show up explicitly in the Christian statements, but they did in secular ones. But the secular ones didn't include sort of a well-roundedness aspect, which we might predict as well. This slide is intentionally blank because they didn't include anything about contextual framework or life balance. That just wasn't part of their thinking about what they want their graduates to do in the future. And then once I had these categories, I could kind of go back and start to think about who showed more themes, right? So we would expect that more of the Christian engineering programs listed some of these things than others, perhaps, as the distinctiveness. So So if you looked at service, the Christian programs, 9 out of 16 mentioned that in some form, whereas the secular programs, only 25%. More emphasis on leadership in the secular programs, more emphasis on stewardship in the Christian programs. So the next step in the analysis was to look at the program student outcomes for the 37 Christian programs. This was complicated a bit by the fact that ABET changed the outcomes. So most of you who are on top of accreditation stuff know that we're now doing 1 through 7 instead of A through K, and we'll hear more on that tomorrow at the panel. But this just shows a quick mapping. So I could still try to look at where there were distinct differences among types of institutions, or here I was focusing mostly on what showed up in common in the Christian programs. And just if you're curious, so of the 37 programs that I looked at, 26 still were using the old A through K, 11 had updated, probably the ones like us that are being visited this fall. And then in terms of looking at all the different sets, some programs had modified them in some way, and some programs had not. They were just using the ABET version verbatim. So it was a little over half that had left them unmodified, and a little less than half that had modified them some way, either by taking the individual A through K and revising them slightly, or adding their own outcomes on the end. And this was, I guess, a bit surprising to me that there were that many programs that had not modified their student outcomes at all, although maybe nothing why that is. You'll have to look at the paper for the details. I know I'm running out of time. So this just looks at for the different programs who had modified them, how had they modified them? Either revised them, added them, or both revised and added in many cases. There wasn't a significant difference in my mind between the percent that had modified them with the new versions versus the old versions, which I thought was interesting. Some of the themes that came out for folks who had added to specific outcomes, so the SO column here is listing the 1 through 7. I divided them sort of into 2 categories. So what things were sort of common in general you might expect to see across all programs. People had gotten more specific about what they wanted in those outcomes, whereas the Christian ones, and some of the same themes that we saw in the PEO analysis show up explicitly here in these outcomes, like normativity, openness, honesty, stewardship, some of those other things. There were also some added SOs that probably could have been added to any program, regardless of their tradition. And there were also some that were specifically Christian. So I tried to align these a little bit with 3 categories. Some of them just had to do with knowledge. Some of us said we need our students to be able to articulate a set of knowledge related to Christian principles that's different. These are all sort of different statements. And these are actually verbatim from program SOs. And then there were some that related to character, some that related to service, and some that related to service integration. So in conclusion, I felt like this was a successful initial analysis of PEOs and SOs to identify distinctives of Christian engineering programs. So I expected there to be common things between Christian programs and secular programs. We all agree on certain expectations for engineers regardless of our faith, but I also observed differences. And for me, it was fun to see those things show up in sort of a concrete way. The next question maybe is, how does that then articulate into curriculum? And a question for me, as we thought about updating our SOs for the fall, is how much do we change them to reflect our Christian perspective? And so sort of in the midst of doing this study, we added 1, but we didn't mess with the other 7 because we thought that would be just easier in the structure of how we assess things, right? Because if we commit to an SO that has something more than what ABET requires, we have to show that we still need that, which can be a challenge. We found that in the past. So I will just conclude by saying that I found the exercise sort of inspirational. It was fun to look at other people's programs and see what they're doing and to use it as a benchmarking exercise, and I hope it's valuable for some of you as you read through that as well and you think about planning. So with that, I'm open to questions.
We do have time for a few questions.
Bill, you mentioned for the secular programs, they emphasize financial considerations. What exact language do they use?
I would have to get back to you on the details of what kinds of incidences caused me to put those in the category. Off the top of my head, I don't remember a specific language related to that. I've got it in a spreadsheet somewhere, but I'd be happy to. Yeah, if anybody's interested in that background information, the whole spreadsheet of where stuff is gathered, I'd be happy to get that to you.
Something that would be hard to do, but I think interesting is if someone could do an analysis of mission statements. Because one of the issues we face is we didn't put we didn't add Christian things to student outcomes because we had to assess them. But we created a much more extensive mission statement so we could communicate to our own constituency the Christian content.
Yeah, I think that'd be the next place to go if I can find time to keep doing this work.
I noticed that you had a caveat about servant leadership, that you didn't feel that encompassed leadership. Curious about
Yeah,
that.
so it was really interesting how to parse out servant leadership when I had developed categories that related to sort of service and leadership separately. And so looking at the context tried to help me, I had to think about what the program was trying to say. Were they trying to emphasize leadership or servanthood? And it was not clear, I will just say. So I made a kind of call to put some in one category and not the other. But it's a tricky concept, right? The world values leadership, perhaps, just as much as we do, but we have sort of our own spin on it, which we call servant leadership, but that relates to service and may not be. But there were a number of secular programs that really emphasize service more than I would have expected as well, too, and I think that's something we need to remember. We're not the only ones who are looking to some of those.
Thank your speaker one more time. Yeah, did I catch correctly? The winner for the most words in their POs was Dordt.
I wasn't surprised.
Our next speaker is Esther Tien's. Her title is Will It Naturally Happen? Faith and Engineering Integration at a Christian University.
There you go. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. It's an honor to learn about faith and engineering and from all of you wonderful people in follow Christ. And today I'm just going to share a little bit of information about the faith and faith and engineering integration at Eastern Maryland University. Eastern Maryland University, by the way, is in Harrisonburg, Virginia. So I'm going to start with some background information and then share with you some results from a study I did, surveys and interviews with my students, and then and with some future work. So background, we started our engineering program in 2016. So this is, we only finished 3 years. So we are we are in the process of preparing for the evaluation and very familiar with all those SOs and POs and all this stuff and the PIs, and program indicators and all that, this rubrics and all that, the hard work. But anyway, when we develop our curriculum, we thought about this question, and that is with animated learning engineering would that happen on its own? If we look at title, some of you probably saw that title is a little naive question for some of you. Did that really happen? Is it in Disney World? But however, the reason is that because we are a Christian university and a Christian faith is part of the core curriculum, and we do have a very strong, very active ESW stands for Engineering for Sustainable World Club, And we do a lot of service projects in that club. So with all these elements, we thought, oh, is that going to, the connection will occur for our student or not? And a little more background. So we heard from Mike last night about Christian engineers. So that's our ultimate goal, to produce Christian engineers. And in Dr. Perkins' essay about, he talked about general callings and particular callings. And the general calling is to become Christian, and then the particular calling is for the particular vocation. Dr. Choi suggested we need to raise our Christian engineers with visions and the callings from God, and I believe there will be talks about callings in this conference for sure. And Dr. Wu here somewhere, I believe, and suggested sowing seeds of grace in the engineering profession. Dr. Diazo talked about 4 levels of integrative pedagogy, like role model, multidimensional value, and synthetic integration. So with all that in mind, so I aimed to look for, find out the best practice for integration of faith and engineering. And so the study I did was the surveys and interviews with the 2 goals. One is to learn about the current status of faith integration at EMU, and then second goal is to determine like what we should do about it, and how are we going to integrate it into the curriculum. So that's the goal of this study. So as I mentioned, I did surveys and the interviews. Those are done with students in the Engineers for Sustainable World Club. The reason I chose this club is because in addition to the regular coursework, this group of students have service learning experience working on those many projects promoting sustainability. So this study is really a baseline study. It's really just getting the information per se. So there were 6 rating questions on the survey. So I'm going to not release all questions here at once, but to show the result and with the questions. So we look at the first 2 questions I asked on the survey. This is about the knowledge and understanding about the relevance of Christianity to engineering. And as you can see from this figure, so majority of the students, more than 50%, feel yes, they understood. I'm also going to, because of the time, I'm not going to separate the survey and interview very much, but kind of combine. So I also asked this question in the interview: how does your faith motivate your learning in engineering? So one student said that it's Bible. The biggest thing from Bible is that he feels encouraged to do all of his work as if doing it for Christ, and so, learning in engineering in general. So if we look at the second pair of questions, so as you can see from the graph, it's shifted to the left. So it shows that our students are less comfortable about using or presenting biblical examples and truth in this field. One student commented that he feels he knows, he understood the relationship, but he didn't think that he had experienced the faith in being emphasized in the classes at EMU. Another student talked about sustainability as a big issue. They definitely recognize that. However, yeah, that's this result. And then for the last two reading questions, as you can see, grammar speakers directly shift to the right. Really, most of them agree or strongly agreed with this the importance of biblical morality and serving others. And a few quotes from Susan again. One I think is really interesting is that he said that it's not just helping people to help people, because that has a bigger meaning. And also another Susan kind of caution about this as well. And he said that he agreed mostly. He really agreed with the last question about serving others. However, he said that the work of helping others through engineering can be carried out in many different ways, not necessarily look at it through the Christian lens. So I think it's interesting to show, to share all this information to see the range and response. So when I asked them where they got this their knowledge about faith applied in engineering, church, family, and friend scored the highest. And then definitely the experience in the ESW club is valuable for them. And then engineering classes, and that's a little bit surprising to me, because we really didn't. We have not had. Given the active time for faith in engineering and innovation at all, like families in no, we didn't do it, and at all. So this is really learning. I'm really learning here from you all. But however, somehow I'm glad to see this result. But we really didn't do much. But even with that little bit of information, we did talk about. Apparently, soon picked up a lot. So that means we really need to do more about it. And we did think about what to do in this survey. I asked them if we would offer a course, and what do you think about it? Do they like it or not? So here, definitely. Most of them really want to learn more about faith and engineering integration, and I did discuss this with some non-engineer major students as well, who are also members of the club. So in the club we have 9 engineering students as well, and definitely 8 out of the 9 really welcome this idea, and they made sure that they will be welcome in this class. They want to pick it and things like that. It's very encouraging. Here in the interview, so you saw the speaking questions, and here are the interview questions. So really focus on what our students think about faith and engineering integration. Do you think this is important? Did you see anything going on like in that aspect, or what do you want to see? What do they want to see in the future? Things like that. So I have already shared some of the sample responses. Is time already? The result kind of with those reading questions as well. Here are some additional sample responses about faith and engineer integration. And one student said that the most important thing is to create a space to allow people to be intentional to talk about it. So that's what we have not done yet. So we have not intentionally done anything. And also, we really want to see this type of integration in real world, like how people integrate their faith into their jobs, not just in academia, but in industry job, for example, as well. So Mike's talk would be excellent for that. Anyway, so the themes from the interviews, they definitely appreciated the community we built around the ESW club. They felt that the projects we did in this club is really, really important and beneficial. And they all believed that faith and engineering integration was important, and they all expressed the desire to have more discussions about it. So apparently from this study is very affirmative that we really do need to do more about it. And therefore, we have these two conclusions. Apparently, the connection will not naturally happen. And we have decided to have a faith and engineering integration unit in our engineering ethics course, which is going to be offered this next year for the first time, because this coming year is our first 4-year cycle to finish our first cycle to study pronunciation. And then in terms of future work, so I'm going to continue interview with the students that have interviewed after their cross-cultural experiences to do a before and after comparative study. And also, I have been selected to the Lilly faculty fellow program. So we just I had a first inaugural conference in June last month. So I'm really very much looking forward to the learning opportunity there and put it in practice at EMU. So I have a lot of learning. I'm learning here, I'm learning in this program, and all that. I think it's wonderful. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I welcome questions.
We have time for a few questions.
Yes.
What do you predict that module would look like in your ethics class, the integration of faith and engineering? Is that like a one lecture kind of thing?
It's one unit. The current plan is to have like maybe 5 it's a block of like 4 topics. That's what I'm planning. This is a plan. It's just a plan. And then, for example, the first one is actually on spirituality and ethics. So what's the difference between the two? Really, so I've been doing a lot of readings. But it's really good. What is his name? Forgot the name of the book. A poem of forgot the name. But anyway, so in that book he said that spirituality, theology, spirituality is for. Sorry. See if I can find it. Try to make it really, really clear for you. And don't make mistakes. As you can see, I'm learning. Basically, I'm trying to. Well, I remember what he said. I'm trying to really say what the phrase he used, but basically, is spirituality versus is the theology and then ethics, morality. That makes sense. Ethics is for is a framework for morality, where theology is a framework for spirituality. So that's a parallel. That's a parallel he's talking about. So first of all, so I wanted to do that, the separation. Like, what's the difference between like when we talk about ethics and spirituality? Because it's ethics, so we want to really make that distinction at the first time. And then we want to talk about, probably I want to talk about Bible and the calling would be the second topic, and then the third topic would be the Bible and the academia, and then the last topic would be in practice, like how you apply it. And very likely we'll and then we invite speakers to talk about that. And then the final there will be a final project for students to write things like the philosophy of engineering. That will be something very big copy, and really give a lot of detailed instruction on how and what is expected. That's the plan. Sorry.
One more question?
Yes. Back there.
To what extent do you feel like the students you talked to in the EW or whatever the club was?
Yeah, ESW.
ESW. To what extent do you feel like they were representative of the rest of your engineering students? And if they weren't entirely, how do you feel like your engineering students would have responded to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I didn't mention, so the students in the study, engineers, there's 15 of them, and so that was done the year before, last couple of years actually. Most of the engineering students are in the club. But this is a more, like the survey is not mandate. You choose if you want to participate or not. I would say it's quite written of the whole group. Yeah. You have a question?
I think we have to stop there.
Oh, sorry.
Our third speaker is Joseph Tipton, speaking on opportunities for faith and learning integration in a mechanical engineering instrumentation and measurement course.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, everyone's awake. Okay, I won't go into reading that long time. Does this work?
Push the other direction.
There we go. Okay. So I'll give a little bit of an introduction and get into what I'm presenting. Lipscomb University is where I work, private Christian liberal arts university in Nashville, associated with the Churches of Christ. Founded a long time ago. Today, large undergraduate enrollment and a growing graduate enrollment as well. The Raymond B. Jones College of Engineering, we started engineering back in 2000. The college and the 3 departments didn't really come about until 2009-ish. So we have 12 faculty, 3 departments, mechanical, civil, and electrical/computer engineering. About 200 students, 100 in mechanical, and the other 50-50 split. We have a fairly new building donated by Charles Fields, Fields Engineering Center. So everything's housed in the same location. We got a lot of neat stuff. We got to be part of the planning for that building. And another distinctive for us is the Peugeot Center for Engineering Service and Developing Communities. So that's where we try to engage students with engineering missions. I think the last time we counted, about a third of our student body chooses to participate in engineering missions at some point while they're with us at Lipscomb. So you can learn more about these online if you're inclined. A little bit about me. I grew up in the church, but secularly educated. I taught, all my degrees were from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I taught at the University of Evansville for 6 years and then came to Lipscomb. And one of the first things they did for me was threw a couple books at me, Faith and Learning by Allen and Badley and The Vocation of the Christian Scholar by Hughes. So those 2 books there on the table. And I started, people were throwing around faith and learning integration. First time I'd really heard that phrase together. And so this is from a presentation I did on trying to integrate in thermodynamics, but the challenge of trying to bring faith together with learning and in an engineering context. So that's sort of what I've been exploring. In terms of motivation, I guess it's sort of an indictment on me that 10 years into teaching, I'm starting to think of what is the purpose of a university. And I've heard the phrase multiversity, and that we just sort of silo ourselves, and then we're just sort of a federation of programs on a similar campus. We've lost that unifying thing that theology provided through historically Christian universities. And then what's the purpose of a Christian university? I really like this quote from Wilkins, just pointing out that it apparently is important to us as Christians because we have a great heritage of founding schools all over the world. One of the first things Christians do when they establish roots in a community. It turns out, the Bible has a lot to say about education, about the life of the mind. Love the Lord your God with all your mind. If anything is worthwhile, pure, lovely, think about such things. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Whatever you do, in word or in deed, do it all in the name of Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And it's pretty obvious that Jesus is above all things, including the life of our minds. And going back to Wilkins here, the Christian confession calls us to a faith that shapes all that we see, think, and do. And then for those of us who are ministers, we minister through education. The way we understand the relationship between faith and reason is not a peripheral matter. Instead, it should be at the center of the way we engage in our calling, in our ministry. So that's, that puts a lot of weight for me into what I do at a purposefully Christian school in trying to teach engineering. This is an interesting list. I don't have the sources listed here. They're in my paper. It's from, I think, 3 different places. This is a list of, I call it the Christian Challenge because these are lists where people have said, this is not faith and learning integration. This is not, shouldn't really fall under that name. And yet it is, I think, a lot of the things that we end up trying to do, at least at my institution. I think in other places we call it sort of like baptizing or sanctifying a curriculum by adding on spiritual components. So things like praying before class or saying that I'm a godly person. A protective atmosphere, another one. Adding or tacking on Bible courses or theology courses. And before you storm out on me here, quote from Beers here, these things are important for equipping the saints and challenging the seeker, but they themselves fall short of the basic task of integrating faith and learning, that connection with the Christian worldview. And in other places, it's pointed out, it's probably very easy to say how a theology or a philosophy course would look very different at a Christian school versus secular school. But in terms of STEM, math is math. Statics is statics. So what does that mean? It's almost more nuanced, more challenging, I think, for us as engineers to try to integrate faith and learning in the classroom. Okay, so I'll get into my attempt at integration with this instrumentation and measurement course and walk you through what I've tried and learned in the process. So the course background, it's a junior level instrumentation and measurement course. It has a lecture component on Mondays and Wednesdays and then a lab on Tuesdays and Thursdays. it covers common data, common measurements of interest to mechanical engineers, transducers, data acquisition, uncertainty analysis. The students work in pairs for 7 labs, and then the last third of the course, they're larger, open-ended, multidisciplinary teams. And deliverables, they're writing reports on other places. So in this class, I focus on them submitting, I call them infographic slide decks. It's basically graphic intensive communication. So in terms of knowledge claims, this motivating question from viewers was helpful for me about, what does my field say about what is and isn't real, what's true and false. And I would say engineers can tend to fall into, I call it knowledge snobbery, the fact-value dichotomy. So, in engineering, we're doing the real stuff, the cold, hard facts, and then you go off on the other side of campus and you take classes where you're just talking about your personal opinions. And we end up sort of, I think, being a little snooty about it. And an interesting thing happens when you go to instrumentation measurement. I think it's Segal's statement, a man with 1 watch knows the time, a man with 2 watches is unsure. So I think it's a little humbling in that you tell the student to go and measure something and then tell them to measure it again, and they get 2 different numbers. And what does that mean? There's something happens when finite human beings try to interact with the world and you get the cold, hard facts, right? All of a sudden you don't get the same number anymore. And so my thinking was, well, maybe this is an opportunity to talk about epistemology, how you know what you know, Come on, that was a joke. So my phase 1, a year ago in the spring semester, in my assignment prompt, I modified. The last deliverable was, summarize your conclusions, and then at the very end, what did you learn? What do you know well? What questions do you still have? I had been asking that, and students had pretty much ignored that. And so I tried to prompt them a little bit more, was my thinking, with the phrase here in orange. So I encourage you to consider these questions from a bigger perspective. How this fits into this semester, how this fits into your engineering coursework, and even step back further, how this fits into the other half of the coursework you take while you're at Lipscomb. And the responses, I had 10 student teams over 7 assignments, so I had 2 instances out of 70 submissions, all the first one, where they actually sort of took the bait. And it wasn't even infographics, they just wrote text. But they were definitely starting to think about it. The 2 phrases are here. I'll let you can read those. I wasn't completely satisfied with that, so phase 2, I came across a really interesting book by Esther Lightcap Meek, A Little Manual for Knowing, which is a really nice introduction to epistemology. It has no citations. She really wanted it to be a primer. Something accessible to people who are not philosophy professors. And also the first chapter is freely available online. So I knew that the students had Friday mornings available because the lecture just meets Mondays and Wednesdays. So I knew I had them available. And I just offered informal Friday discussions on engineering and how it relates to Christianity and life. And to my surprise, I had 10 students out of 32 attend consistently over 11 weeks. And we did readings from the chapter, just everyone aloud, taking turns, and then using the questions at the end to sort of guide discussion was what ended up happening. And the topics, things you probably don't hear a lot in engineering classes: love, pledge, invitation, indwelling, tacit knowledge from Michael Polanyi, subsidiary focal integration as well. Some things that actually really did, I think, apply to what the students were struggling with in their coursework. Okay, the assignment prompt I kept the same. This time I had a lot more students, 32 students over 7 assignments. I only had 4 responses. So the numbers still don't look that good. The comments, although are really nice, multiple measurements made in different ways provide for better results. What else can be evaluated in different ways for better results? And the students had infographic art, science, religion. They're thinking about it. I had one shining example of what I'd really been looking for with infographic, graphical communication, where they actually, through an epistemology, starting to think about uncertainty as they were determining the spring constant of surgical tubing, and starting to think about what they know, what they don't know, the fuzziness of it, and uncertainty. So I was amazed when I saw that. But it was the one team, one submission, and then the rest it all fell off. However, at the end, that last Friday, I told the students about this conference and that I was thinking about doing a paper for it, and I was asking their reflections on the semester with the readings we've done. And I mean, these statements were extremely encouraging for me to hear them reflect on this. You know, there's talk about not just getting through engineering to get a job. There's a greater meaning to what they're doing. The quote there in the middle spoke to that open-ended design project and some of the fear in thinking, I'm not a double E, you know, they're going to take care of the electrical stuff. And the fear of maybe thinking I have to know it all before I can do something, and having that freedom to sort of step out and try something and then learn as you're engaging with it, I think was really, really great to hear. I didn't include it here. I even had an email from a student late one night before the end of the project saying he'd had an epiphany moment. We've been talking about that in one of the readings, where learning is not linear. We present it as such in books, and we build it up, and then students sometimes get frustrated because we don't learn linearly, right? We keep on working at it, and then suddenly we have an aha moment, an epiphany, things start to sink in. And it's okay to not be getting it, and realize that it's going to come at some point. So in terms of reflections, I think I had unreasonable expectations on the deliverables. Cognitive overload, I'm asking them to do new lab assignments hands-on, and to analyze data, and then to take that and put it in graphical communication. And then I'm asking them to graphically talk about epistemology as well. So I think that was unreasonable on my part. And yet, self-reflection was indeed occurring throughout the course. So what began as a tool to help motivate reflection on slide submissions turned out to itself become the primary vehicle for self-reflection and epistemology. After the fact, I came back to this book, Teaching in Christian Practices, which I wish I had read more thoroughly before I did all this. I think what I was doing was, I was trying to get them to require behaviors on deliverables, which was not very successful, but the phrase of recruiting imaginations to see engineering differently. At least with those 10 students, I think I was very happy with that. Reading this as well, I think what I ended up doing was accidentally practice Christian hospitality. I opened up the space outside of class with students, and we went through a bit of life together in the process. So that moving forward, I think in this class and maybe in some others, I'm going to try to explore a little bit more of the writings on Christian practices, especially hospitality, and how I can engage more students with that. Yep, that's it. Yes?
Was the book by Esther Meek, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a Christian book?
Yes, although it's not like beat you down your head, Christian. So she presents it, I think, very well, and then she shows, how she thinks a Christian worldview and approaching epistemology makes learning. She calls them knowledge adventures. So whether it be, learning in college or starting a new business, any knowing venture makes better sense, when you approach it from the worldview of the one who made it.
It sounds like you like the book. You'd recommend it.
Oh yes, I really would. And that first chapter is freely available online. So.
It's from Geneva.
Pardon?
It's from Geneva College.
Ah, okay.
Oh, on that last slide, you talked about requiring behaviors on deliverables. What do you mean by that? Can I expound on that a little bit, and how that would work?
So with the slide submissions, my thinking was in students, I think when a professional writes a paper, one of the first things they're doing is trying to communicate through the graphics, and then you build the text around that. I think students tend to approach it the opposite. So it's a lot of writing, sometimes sort of stream of consciousness, and then tacking on some poor quality images at the end. And so they're writing in other places, they take a technical writing course. This was my opportunity to sort of require them to force graphical communication. So I was trying to require that, and then also require the behavior of how does what you're doing in this lab connect to knowledge in general and in a liberal arts education. So me trying to require that, it was the first thing they left off after the first lab submission. And I think they were obviously interested in it, or I wouldn't have had a third of the class continue throughout the semester with the discussions. They were obviously using it from that reflection at the end. It's just that they were budgeting their time appropriately, I think.
Was that part of the grade then? Did you actually require that self-reflection part?
Oh, it was graded, yeah. So I mean, but at a small portion. So they were willing to take a ding, at 1 or 2 points consistently. Economics, right? Thank you very much.
That concludes this session. I believe we have break time now, yes?
Yeah, we have a break, and there should be coffee and snacks just to the left out.